With my husband's life insurance, I bought a ranch to live out our dream. Then my son called me. Stay in the garage for a few days. I'm bringing my wife with her parents and friends. If you embarrass us, I'll put you in a nursing home. I said nothing, but when they arrived, they found a surprise. I'm glad you're here with me. Follow my story to the end and comment which city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Dorothy Thompson. I'm 65 years old. And I never imagined that the worst betrayal of my life would come from my own son. Everything started 3 months after Harold's funeral. My husband of 42 years. I could still feel the emptiness he'd left in our bed, in the kitchen where we used to have breakfast together every morning, in every corner of the house we'd built with so much love. The life insurance policy Harold had kept secret was a complete shock. $500,000, a sum we'd never had in our entire lives together. Money enough to change everything. For weeks the money sat untouched in the bank account, while I mourned the loss of the only man who had ever truly loved me. Harold had always dreamed of a small ranch in the countryside, a place where we could raise a few chickens, maybe some goats, and grow our own vegetables. When I retired, he used to tell me while stroking my hair, we'll buy that ranch and live the way God intended, away from all this city noise. But Harold died before he could retire, before we could make that dream come true. That's when I decided I would do it for him, for us, for all those years we'd planned that quiet life in the country. The ranch I found was 2 hours outside Portland, Oregon, surrounded by rolling green hills, and with a small creek running through the property. The main house was modest but solid, with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, overlooking the garden, and a porch where I could picture myself, sitting every evening watching the sunset. There were stables for horses, though I had no idea how to care for them, and enough land to plant whatever I wanted. The price was $380,000, leaving me with enough for renovations and living expenses. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning, trembling with excitement. It was the first major decision I'd made without Harold, but I knew he would be proud. That same afternoon I couldn't contain my joy, and called Brandon, my only son. Mom. His voice sounded surprised. Brandon was 40 years old and worked as an insurance manager in Seattle. He'd been living there with his wife Melissa for the past 7 years. Everything's fine, Brandon. Honey, I have wonderful news, I said, feeling my heart racing with pure happiness. I bought a ranch. A beautiful ranch in the countryside, just like your dad and I always dreamed about. The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. You bought what? His tone had changed completely. A ranch, Brandon. It's perfect. It has everything I need, and plenty of space for when you come visit with Melissa. You could stay on weekends, bring the kids when you have them. Mom, have you lost your mind? His voice turned harsh, cruel. What money did you use to buy a ranch? Don't tell me you spent Dad's insurance on that stupidity. I was speechless. Stupidity. That's what he called the dream his father and I had shared for decades. Brandon, I thought you'd be happy. It's a beautiful place and there's enough room for the whole family. Mom, listen to me carefully, he interrupted, and I could hear Melissa talking in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. I have plans for next weekend. Melissa wants to bring her parents and some friends to see the ranch. My heart filled with hope. Maybe he'd reacted badly at first, but now he wanted to visit me. How wonderful, son. I'll prepare the guest rooms and cook something special. It's been so long since I've seen Melissa. No, Mom. Listen carefully because I'm not going to repeat this. His voice turned cold, calculating. You're going to prepare a space in the garage for yourself. The garage, understand? Melissa doesn't want her parents thinking we can't afford a decent place for vacation. If you embarrass us in any way, if you make any inappropriate comments or act like the pathetic old woman you've become, I'll put you in a nursing home so fast you won't even know how you got there. The words hit me like physical punches. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls of my new kitchen were closing in on me. My own son was asking me to sleep in a garage like I was some kind of animal. Brandon, I whispered, my voice breaking. Why are you talking to me like this? I'm your mother. You're a burden, Mom. You always have been, since Dad died. Melissa and I had plans for that insurance money. Real plans, not farm fantasies like a 5-year-old child. That money was Dad's, and I'm his son. I had more right than you to decide what to do with it. I could hear Renata laughing in the background. We'll see you Friday night. Have the garage ready, and don't make us look bad. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there holding the phone to my ear, listening to the dead line while tears began streaming down my cheeks. In my new kitchen, surrounded by boxes to unpack and dreams to build, I felt more alone than ever. But in the middle of that overwhelming sadness, something else began to wake up, something that had been asleep for years of being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the woman who always gave in and forgave. A spark of something Harold had seen in me when we were young, but that I'd buried under layers of domesticity and sacrifice. Brandon had made a mistake. A very big mistake, because if he wanted to play dirty, he was about to discover that his mother knew how to play that game much better than he ever imagined. The 3 days following that phone call were the strangest of my life. On the outside, I was still the same Dorothy as always. Unpacking boxes, organizing the house, trying to adapt to life on the ranch, but inside something had changed forever. That night, after Brandon's call, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the porch, looking at the stars, and thinking about my son's words. A burden. Pathetic old woman. I'll put you in a nursing home. Each phrase was like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But when the sun rose, something else had been born along with the new day. A cold determination I hadn't felt in decades. On Wednesday morning, while I was cleaning the garage to convert it into my temporary bedroom, I found an old box the previous owners had left behind. Inside were some unimportant papers and an old landline phone that still worked. I connected it in the garage thinking maybe I'd need it. It was that same day when I overheard the first conversation. I was organizing some old blankets when the phone in the main house rang. There was an extension in the garage, and by pure chance, I picked up the receiver at the same time. Someone answered in the house. It was Brandon. Melissa, it's me, my son said, and something in his tone made me stay very still without hanging up. Did you already talk to the old lady? My daughter-in-law's voice sounded contemptuous. Bored. Yeah, I told her to sleep in the garage. She started crying like always, but she's going to obey. Melissa laughed. Perfect. My parents are going to be impressed with the house. How much did you say it was worth? I told them it cost $650,000, not $380. I want them to think we have more money than we really do. Smart. And after the weekend, when do we start with the plan? My blood froze. What plan? Give her another month, Brandon answered. Let her get comfortable. Let her feel secure. Then we start with the psychological pressure. You know those doctors who declare people mentally incompetent? Right. My cousin's a psychiatrist. For $8,000 he'll sign any paper we need. Perfect. Once we declare her incompetent, as her only son I'll have legal power of attorney over all her properties. We'll sell this ranch and keep all the money. And what do we do with her? Put her in the cheapest nursing home we can find. With luck she won't last long there. Old women die fast when you take them out of their environment. Melissa laughed again. A cruel sound that cut through me like a knife. You're diabolical, Brandon. I love it. I learned from the best. My father was too soft with her. I'm not going to make the same mistake. Do you think she suspects anything? My mom's too stupid and sentimental. She still thinks I'm her perfect little boy. I could steal her dentures and she'd find a way to justify me. They hung up, and I sat on the garage floor holding the phone with trembling hands. My own son, my only son, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, who I'd stayed up with when he had fevers, who I'd defended from every teacher and principal who complained about his behavior. That same child was now planning to steal everything I had and lock me in a nursing home to die alone. But there was something else that disturbed me. Brandon had mentioned he'd learned from the best. What did he mean? Harold had never been cruel to me. Never. That night, I decided to go through the boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. They were mainly Harold's papers, work documents, old bills, family photos, but at the bottom of one of the boxes I found something that left me breathless. It was a folder marked Brandon Confidential in Harold's handwriting. Inside were letters, printed emails, and handwritten notes. With my heart beating faster and faster, I started reading. The first letter was from Brandon, dated 3 years ago. Dad, I urgently need you to lend me $10,000. It's a sure investment. I'll pay you back in 6 months with interest. Mom can't know because you know how she gets about money. Harold's response was written by hand in the margin. Brandon, this is the 5th time you've asked me for money this year. What's really going on? And don't tell me it's for an investment because the other 4 times you said the same thing, and I never saw a cent back. I kept reading. There were documents showing Brandon had been asking Harold for money constantly for the past 6 years. Always with different excuses. Problems at work, a medical emergency with Melissa, investments that turned out to be scams, gambling debts he'd hidden. In total, Harold had lent him over $95,000 that Brandon had never returned. But what hurt me most was finding a letter Harold had written but never sent. My love. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. There are things about Brandon I never told you because I didn't want to hurt you. Our son is not the man we think he is. He's lied to me, stolen from me, and manipulated me for years. But worst of all, he threatened me. He told me if I ever told you the truth about him, he'd find a way to hurt you. That's why I kept quiet. That's why I let him continue being your perfect boy. But I fear for you, Dorothy. I fear what he'll do when I'm no longer here to protect you. Please be careful. Don't trust him. And remember, you were always stronger than you believed. Tears soaked the paper as I read the last lines. Harold had known all this time who Brandon really was, but had kept the secret to protect me. At that moment, I heard a car parking outside. Brandon and Melissa had arrived a day earlier than planned. I rushed to hide all the documents and ran to the garage pretending I'd been sleeping. Through the small window, I watched them enter the house as if it were theirs, turning on lights, opening cabinets, commenting on what changes they'd make when it was officially theirs. But I was no longer the same woman who had cried in this same garage 3 days ago. Now I had information. I had proof. And I had a plan that was beginning to form in my mind. Brandon and Melissa had come to humiliate me, to treat me like a servant in my own house, to begin the process of destroying my life. What they didn't know was that their perfect victim had disappeared forever. But what happened next would change everything in ways I never could have imagined. Friday night arrived, and the Hayes family pulled up in a black Mercedes, dressed in expensive clothes and commenting on how picturesque the place was. Melissa greeted them at the front door as if she owned the house, while Brandon carried the luggage with a smile I knew all too well, the same fake smile he'd used since childhood when he wanted something. I stayed in the garage until Brandon came looking for me. Mom, get out of there! Melissa's parents want you to prepare dinner for 8 people. His tone was a mixture of command and contempt. And put on something decent. You look like a homeless person. I was wearing the same blue blouse Harold had given me for our last anniversary. It was one of my favorites, but under Brandon's critical gaze, I suddenly felt small and shabby. I entered the house I'd bought with my own money and headed to the kitchen. The guests were in the living room drinking wine and laughing. I could hear fragments of their conversation. Brandon was telling us about this very smart investment, said Melissa's father, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache. $650,000 for a property already worth $800,000. He's got a good eye for business. Melissa laughed, a musical sound she'd perfected for these occasions. My husband is very shrewd. He always finds the best opportunities. They were brazenly lying about the ranch's price, inflating it by over $250,000. But I kept quiet, preparing roasted chicken with vegetables while listening to every word. "And your mother?" asked one of Melissa's friends. "Does she live here with you?" There was an uncomfortable pause before Brandon answered. "My mother is complicated. Since my father died, she hasn't been well mentally. We're taking care of her, but it's difficult." "Poor thing," murmured another voice. "It must be very hard for you both." "It is," Melissa sighed with fake sadness. "But Brandon is so patient with her. I don't know if I'd have his strength." I stood motionless by the oven, feeling that the heat from the kitchen was nothing compared to the fury growing in my chest. They were painting me as a senile old woman who depended on their kindness, as if they were the martyrs and I was the burden. When I finished preparing dinner, Brandon came to inspect my work. He tasted the sauce and frowned. "It's too salty. Make it again." "Brandon, the sauce is perfect. I've made it this way for 30 years, and your father loved it." "My father's not here anymore, and our guests won't like it." "Make it again and don't contradict me in front of them." I was about to protest when Melissa appeared in the kitchen. She wore an elegant black dress and jewelry that cost more than my car. She looked me up and down with barely disguised disdain. "Is dinner ready? Our guests are waiting." "Almost," I murmured, beginning to make a new sauce. "Good. And Brandon told me you've been having trouble remembering things lately." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold as ice. "Is it true you forgot to turn off the stove yesterday?" It was a lie. I'd never forgotten to turn off anything, but I could see where this conversation was going. "I didn't forget anything, Melissa." She exchanged a significant look with Brandon. "Well, we all get older. It's natural for the mind to start failing." "My mind is fine." "Of course, dear." Her smile was condescending. "That's why it's so important you have people to take care of you." During dinner, they treated me like an invisible servant. I served the plates, filled the wine glasses, and cleaned up spills while they talked, as if I didn't exist. But when Brandon started telling the story of how he'd convinced his mother to buy the ranch, I couldn't stay quiet. "Actually," I said from where I was collecting plates, "I decided to buy the ranch because it was the dream Roberto and I had shared for decades." The silence at the table was immediate and tense. Brandon glared at me. "Mom, the adults are talking." "I'm an adult, Brandon. And this is my house." Melissa cleared her throat nervously. "Of course it's your house, Mrs. Dorothy. Brandon just meant that." I know exactly what Brandon meant. My voice was firmer than it had been in days. "Just like I know exactly why you're here." Melissa's father frowned, confused. "Excuse me?" Brandon stood up abruptly from his chair. "Mom, I think it's time for you to retire. Are you confused?" "I'm not confused at all." I addressed Melissa's father directly. "Your son-in-law told you this ranch cost $650,000, right?" The man nodded slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the tension that had taken over the room. "Interesting, because I have right here the purchase papers showing I paid $380,000. I pulled the documents from my apron and placed them on the table." "Why do you think Brandon would lie to you about that?" Melissa visibly paled. "Mrs. Dorothy, I think you're confused about—" "I also have here," I continued, pulling out more papers, "documents showing Brandon borrowed over $95,000 from my late husband over the past 6 years. Money he never returned." "Mom, shut up," Brandon shouted, but it was too late. The guests were looking at the documents with expressions of shock and confusion. The festive atmosphere had completely disappeared. "And most interesting of all," I said, my voice now completely calm and controlled, "yesterday I overheard a very revealing phone conversation between Brandon and Melissa about their plans to declare me mentally incompetent and sell my property." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the tick-tock of the kitchen clock and Brandon's agitated breathing. Melissa attempted one last desperate play. "This is exactly what we wanted to avoid. As you can see, she's having one of her episodes." Brandon, maybe we should call the doctor. Episodes. I laughed, a sound I hadn't heard come from my throat in years. You're gonna keep lying even now? I pulled out my phone, the same one I'd used to record the conversation they'd had that very afternoon planning the details of their scheme. Do you want to hear exactly what you said about me 3 hours ago? Brandon lunged at me trying to take my phone, but I'd already pressed play. His own voice filled the dining room, clear and cruel. The old lady is completely under control. By Monday I'll have the psychiatrist's papers. In 2 weeks this ranch will be ours. Melissa's parents stood up simultaneously, their faces showing a mixture of horror and disgust. The other couples exchanged uncomfortable glances and began murmuring among themselves. Brandon, said Richard Hayes with a tense voice, I think we need an explanation. But Brandon could no longer maintain his mask of devoted son. His face had transformed into something I recognized from his childhood, the expression of a child caught in a lie, willing to do anything to get away with it. She has no right to anything, he finally exploded. That money should have been mine. I'm her only son. And there it was, the truth he'd been hiding behind false smiles and feigned concern. The truth Harold had seen but never told me. My son didn't love me. He never had. He'd only seen me as a source of money. And when that source dried up, an obstacle to eliminate. The dining room had become a silent battlefield. The guests remained motionless, like statues, witnesses to a family tragedy unfolding before their eyes. Brandon was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides, while Melissa desperately tried to find a way out of the situation. Brandon, murmured Richard Hayes, his voice loaded with disappointment. What does all this mean? My son ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. For a moment I thought maybe he'd apologize, that he'd find some vestige of the conscience I'd tried to instill in him for years. But when he looked up, his eyes shone with a rage that chilled my blood. It means my mother is a manipulative old woman trying to ruin my life. He spat the words like venom. All of this is a lie. She recorded that conversation, out of context. Out of context. I couldn't help but laugh, a harsh sound that echoed in the room. Brandon, explain to me in what context is it acceptable to plan to steal everything from your mother and lock her in a nursing home? Melissa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. This is ridiculous, Brandon. Let's go. We don't have to tolerate these accusations. Sit down, Melissa. The voice came from Richard Hayes, but it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The man had been a judge for 30 years before retiring, and his judicial tone had appeared automatically. I want to hear the rest of this recording. Dad, you don't have to, Melissa began, but he silenced her with a look. I turned up the phone's volume. Melissa's voice came through clear as crystal. My cousin can sign the mental incapacity papers for $8,000. He knows judges who'll help us. Richard Hayes's face hardened like granite. His wife, an elegant woman who hadn't said a word all night, brought her hand to her chest. Your cousin the psychiatrist? She asked slowly. The one you introduced us to last year. Melissa had lost all color from her face. Dad, can I explain? No. His voice cut through the air like a whip. There's no explanation for this. But Brandon wasn't going to give up without a fight. He approached me with threatening steps, and for the first time in my life, I felt real fear of my own son. You know what, Mom? You're right. Yes, I planned all of this. And you know why? His voice got louder, higher. Because you deserve it. Because my whole life has been a burden. Dad and I had to constantly lie to you to protect your feelings. We had to pretend you mattered when really you were just nothing. Each word was a slap, but strangely, they no longer hurt. It's hard to explain what it feels like when you finally see someone exactly as they really are. The Brandon I'd loved, the son I'd sacrificed so much for, had never existed. He was just an illusion I'd created to fill the void in my heart. Dad knew, I asked softly. Of course he knew. He's the one who taught me how to handle you. Tell her what she wants to hear, Brandon. It's easier than dealing with her drama. You think he really cared about you. He put up with you because he was too much of a coward to leave you. That lie did hurt. Because I knew it was exactly that. A lie designed to wound. Harold had truly loved me. The letters I'd found proved it. He'd kept quiet about Brandon to protect me, not because he didn't love me. Dad loved you, Brandon, I said sadly. That's why he never told me what you really were. Because he knew it would destroy me. Dad was a sentimental idiot, Brandon shouted. And you're worse. It was then that one of Melissa's friends stood up. He was an older, distinguished man who had been listening to everything in silence. Excuse me, he said, addressing me. But you mentioned you have recordings of this conspiracy. I nodded, still looking at Brandon, who was now pacing around the room like a caged animal. And documents proving the unreturned loans, all signed by Brandon, I confirmed. The man nodded thoughtfully. I'm a lawyer specializing in family law. What you've just described constitutes several crimes: conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted extortion, and possibly other charges. Brandon stopped dead. What are you saying? I'm saying your mother has enough evidence to file criminal charges against you and your wife. Melissa collapsed in her chair, finally understanding the magnitude of what they'd done. Brandon, you said this wasn't risky. You said it was harmless. Shut up, Brandon yelled at her. But it was too late. Melissa's parents looked at each other and I could see the exact moment they made their decision. Patricia Hayes spoke for the first time all evening. Melissa, pack your things. We're leaving now. Mom, please. I said now. Her voice allowed no discussion. And when we get home, you're going to explain to me how we raised a daughter capable of something like this. The other guests also began standing up, clearly uncomfortable and anxious to escape the situation. Within minutes, the house had emptied, except for Brandon, Melissa, and me. Brandon approached me one last time and I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than his anger. An absolute coldness, as if he'd decided I no longer existed for him. This isn't over, he said quietly. I'll find a way to take everything from you. I promise. No, Brandon. My voice was firmer than it had been in years. This is completely over. I pulled out another set of papers from my apron, documents I'd prepared after finding Harold's letters. These are documents transferring ownership of this ranch to an irrevocable trust. You're not the beneficiary. In fact, there's a specific clause excluding you from any inheritance in case you try to declare me incompetent or manipulate me in any way. Brandon snatched the papers from my hands, reading frantically. His face went from shock to understanding to absolute fury. You can't do this. I'm your son. No, I said with a calm that surprised even me. A son doesn't try to destroy his mother. A son doesn't plan to steal everything she has. A son doesn't threaten to lock her in a nursing home to die alone. Melissa had been reading over Brandon's shoulder. What does this mean exactly? It means, I responded, that when I die, this property and all my remaining money will go to a charitable organization that helps elderly victims of family abuse. Brandon won't receive a single cent. You're a vengeful bitch. Brandon threw the papers on the floor. You always knew. You always knew you weren't a good mother. His words bounced off me without causing harm. It was as if I'd developed invisible armor against his cruelty. You're right about one thing, Brandon. I wasn't a good mother, because a good mother would have set boundaries. A good mother wouldn't have allowed you to become this. They headed toward the door, Brandon muttering threats and curses, Melissa crying and trying to reason with him. But before leaving, Brandon turned one last time. This isn't love, he said with a cruel smile. This is pure hatred. No, Brandon, I answered softly. This is self-love. After they left, I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by dirty dishes and half-finished wine glasses. But for the first time in months, maybe in years, I felt completely at peace. I'd lost a son, but I'd found something much more valuable, my own dignity. And this time no one was going to take it away from me. The days following that confrontation were the strangest of my life. It was as if I'd awakened from a decades-long dream. a dream in which I'd lived for others while losing myself. For the first time in 65 years, I didn't have to worry about anyone's expectations, but my own. Monday morning, while I was drinking coffee on my porch and watching the sunrise over the hills, I heard a car approaching on the gravel driveway. My first instinct was panic. Brandon had returned. He'd come to make good on his threats. But when I recognized the blue car, my heart calmed. It was the lawyer who'd been at dinner, Melissa's friend, who'd witnessed the whole confrontation. "Mrs. Thompson," he said as he got out of the car, "I hope I'm not bothering you so early." "Not at all," I replied, inviting him to sit on the porch. "Would you like some coffee?" "I'd love some." He sat in one of the wicker chairs Harold had bought years ago. "I came because I haven't been able to stop thinking about what happened Friday night." I served him coffee in a porcelain cup that had belonged to my mother. "Have you known Brandon for long?" "Not personally. I met him through Melissa, about 2 years ago. He always seemed charming, I suppose, but I'd never seen that side of him." We sat in silence for a moment, watching as the first bees of the day visited the flowers in my garden. "Mrs. Thompson, I came to offer you my professional services at no cost." I looked at him with surprise. "Why would you do that?" "Because I have a 75-year-old mother," he said softly. "And because what I saw Friday reminded me how vulnerable older people can be when their own family turns against them." "I'm not vulnerable," I responded automatically. But he smiled. "No, you definitely aren't. In fact, I think you're one of the strongest women I've met. But that doesn't mean you don't need legal protection." He explained that Brandon and Melissa probably wouldn't give up, that they'd try to find other ways to invalidate the trust, maybe alleging I'd been manipulated by someone else to sign it. "And they can do that?" "They can try. But I have a better idea." His eyes gleamed with something that looked like mischief. "How about we get ahead of their moves?" That same afternoon, the lawyer, whose name was Michael Brennan, returned with a full team. A forensic psychologist who could certify my mental competence, an accountant who'd review all my finances to prove I hadn't been coerced, and a social worker specialized in elder abuse. "This is excessive," I protested, as I watched them install a camera in my living room. "Mrs. Thompson," Mike said patiently, "your son threatened you directly. He said he'd find a way to take everything from you. We have to be prepared." He was right, of course. That same night Brandon called. "Mom." His voice was different now, controlled, as if he'd been practicing what he was going to say. "I've been thinking about what happened. I think we both said things we didn't really mean." "I meant every word I said, Brandon." "Mom, I know you're angry, but we're family. We can fix this." "Fix what exactly? The fact that you planned to rob me, or the fact that you wanted to lock me in a nursing home to die alone?" There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of remorse. "You have 72 hours to reverse that trust transfer." "Or what?" "Or you're going to discover what I can really do when I set my mind to something." He hung up before I could respond. Mike had been right. Brandon wasn't gonna give up. The next day the attacks began. First it was phone calls at all hours, Brandon alternating between tearful pleas and direct threats. Then came the unexpected visits. He'd show up at the door at different times, sometimes alone, sometimes with Melissa, always demanding we talk. "Mom? Open the door. I know you're in there." "Mom? This is ridiculous. I'm your son." "Mom, if you don't open this door, I'm calling social services and telling them you're abandoned out here." But I didn't open it. Mike had advised me not to have direct contact with them, and every visit was being recorded by the security cameras he'd installed. On Wednesday, Brandon escalated his tactics. He arrived with a man who introduced himself as a doctor and who shouted through the door that he had a court order to evaluate my mental state. "Mrs. Thompson," shouted the supposed doctor, "your son is concerned about your well-being. We just want to make sure you're okay." I called Mike immediately. "There's no court order," he assured me after making some calls. "That man isn't even a doctor. He's an actor Brandon hired." Thursday night, Brandon brought reinforcements. He arrived with Melissa, her parents, and two men I didn't recognize. This time, they didn't leave when I didn't open the door. "Mom," Brandon shouted. "These gentlemen are from the Adult Protective Services Department. They came because we're worried about you." I watched from my bedroom window. The officials wore cheap suits and one of them was smoking a cigarette. Real officials would never have behaved like that. "Mike," I whispered on the phone. "They're here again. This time they brought people claiming to be from the government. I'm on my way. Don't go out under any circumstances." But Brandon had lost his patience. I heard a loud noise like someone had hit the back door. Then the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. They'd broken the kitchen window. "Mom," Brandon's voice came from inside the house. "Now come out wherever you are. We just want to help you." I hid in my bedroom closet, my heart beating so hard I thought they might hear it. I could hear their footsteps through the house, opening doors, shouting my name. "We know you're here, Mom. Your car's outside." Then I heard Melissa's voice. "Brandon, this is wrong. We're committing breaking and entering." "Shut up. It's my mother, and this is the house that should be mine." The footsteps were getting closer to my bedroom. I was sure they'd find me when I heard the sirens. Mike had called the police. "Police. Everyone come out with your hands up." I heard screams, running footsteps, doors slamming. Then silence. When I finally came out of the closet, I found Mike waiting for me in the living room, surrounded by police officers. "Are you okay?" he asked, checking me for injuries. "I'm okay. What happened to Brandon?" "Arrested. Breaking and entering, property damage, harassment." "Melissa too." I sat heavily on my sofa, shaking from the adrenaline. "How did you know to come?" "The cameras are connected to my phone. I saw everything that happened." He showed me his cell phone where I could see the recording of Brandon breaking the window. This, plus all the recordings of the phone threats, should be enough to get a permanent restraining order. That night alone in my house with temporarily repaired windows and new locks, I realized something. Brandon had crossed a line from which there was no return. It was no longer just greed or manipulation. It was real violence. My son had become a physical threat to me. But strangely, I didn't feel fear. I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Power. The power to decide my own destiny, to protect myself, to say no, and have it respected. Brandon had come to take everything I had. Instead, he'd given me something I didn't know I'd lost. My own strength. And this time, no one was going to take it away from me. 6 months after Brandon's arrest, I woke up on my ranch, as I had every morning since then, in complete peace. The sun filtered through the new curtains I'd bought. Cheerful curtains with yellow flowers. Harold would have adored. I no longer lived in a house full of painful memories. Now I lived in a home that was completely mine. The restraining order had been made permanent after the trial. Brandon had been sentenced to 1 year probation for breaking and entering and harassment. Melissa, surprisingly, had cooperated with the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. During the legal process, she'd revealed more details about Brandon's plans, including his intention to drug me to make it look like I had dementia. "I never thought he'd go that far," Melissa had testified through tears. "At first it was just talking about money, but then he became obsessed. He said you had stolen his inheritance." Melissa's parents had completely divorced themselves from the situation. Richard, the ex-judge, had come to apologize personally. "We raised our daughter to be better than this," he'd told me sitting on the same porch where it had all begun. "I have no excuse for her behavior." "You're not responsible for Melissa's choices," I'd responded. "Just like I'm not responsible for Brandon's." It had been a healing conversation for both of us. This particular morning was special. It was the first anniversary of buying the ranch, and I decided to celebrate it in a way Harold would have approved. Mike arrived early as he'd promised. Over the past months, he'd become not just my lawyer but a genuine friend. He brought with him a woman named Sarah, director of an organization that helped victims of family abuse. "Dorothy," Sarah said as she observed my property, "this is perfect. During the months of emotional recovery, I'd been thinking about what to do with the rest of my life. I was 65 years old, in good health, and had more money than I needed to live comfortably. But more importantly, I had experience in something no one wants to have. I knew what it was like to be betrayed by your own family. "Are you sure this will work?" I asked as we walked toward the stables I'd converted into small cabins. "It'll work," Sarah assured me. "There are many older women in situations similar to what you experience. Women who need a safe place to rebuild their lives." I decided to convert my ranch into a temporary refuge for elderly women who'd been victims of abuse or family abandonment. It wasn't a large institution or a complex organization. It was simply a place where women like me could find peace, security, and time to heal. The first 3 residents arrived that afternoon. Gloria was 70 years old and had been thrown out of her house by her son after he got married. "My daughter-in-law said I was a burden," she told me as I showed her her cabin. 40 years living in that house, and they threw me out like a dog. Susan, 66, had been a victim of financial abuse by her grandchildren. "They used my credit card to buy a car," she explained. "When I confronted them, they told me I was senile and didn't remember giving them permission." Barbara, the youngest of the group at 61, had escaped a situation where her daughter had been drugging her to control her behavior. "I thought I was going crazy," she whispered, "until my neighbor told me she'd seen my daughter putting something in my food." Listening to their stories, I realized Brandon wasn't an isolated case. Elder abuse by family members was more common than I'd imagined. But I also realized something more important. None of us had to accept it. "This is a place where you can take all the time you need," I told them during our first dinner together. "There's no rush, no pressure, just healing." Mike had structured everything legally, so the refuge would be self-sufficient. The trust I'd established provided funds for property maintenance and a small stipend for each resident. It wasn't charity, it was justice. The first months were challenging. Gloria suffered panic attacks. Susan had developed a deep distrust of all banks and legal documents. And Barbara had constant nightmares. But slowly, with patience and mutual support, we began to heal together. Gloria discovered she had a talent for gardening and turned a vacant lot into a thriving vegetable garden. Susan, who'd been an accountant before retiring, took charge of the refuge's finances with a meticulousness that impressed me. Barbara, who'd been a teacher, began teaching literacy classes in the nearby town. Each one found her purpose again. I found mine too. One autumn afternoon, while I was sitting on my porch watching Gloria work in the garden, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Thompson." The voice was of a young woman, nervous. "My name is Jennifer. I'm a social worker from General Hospital. We have a 73-year-old woman here who was beaten by her grandson. We were given your number as a possible refuge." "Of course," I responded immediately. "When can you bring her?" "This afternoon. She has nowhere to go and the grandson is still threatening her." "We'll be waiting for her." That night, as I helped the new resident, a fragile woman named Carol, get settled in her cabin, I thought about the journey I'd traveled. A year ago, I was a 65-year-old woman who'd lost her husband and believed her only purpose was to be a good mother to a son who didn't love her. Now I was the director of a refuge that had helped 10 women rebuild their lives. I was a woman who woke up every morning with a clear purpose. I was someone who'd found strength in places she never thought existed. 3 weeks later, Mike arrived with news. "Brandon wants to see you," he told me while we drank coffee in the kitchen. "What for?" "He says he wants to apologize. His probation officer says he's been attending therapy and seems genuinely remorseful." I considered the possibility for a moment. A part of me, the part that had been a mother for 40 years, felt a flash of hope. Maybe Brandon had really changed. Maybe he'd learned from his mistakes. But then I thought about Gloria, about Susan, about Barbara, about Carol, and all the other women who'd passed through my refuge with similar stories. I thought about the excuses they'd heard, the empty promises of change, the second chances that had turned into new opportunities for abuse. No, I finally said. I don't want to see him. Are you sure? Maybe. Mike, I interrupted him gently. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconnecting with whoever hurt you. I've forgiven Brandon in my heart, but that doesn't mean I have to allow him back into my life. He nodded, understanding. Do you want me to give him any message? Yes. Tell him I hope he finds peace and healing, but that he'll find it without me. That night, I sat on my porch, as I did every evening, watching the lights turn on in the cabins, where my residents were preparing their dinners, reading books, or simply enjoying the silence that comes with safety. My phone vibrated with a text message from Susan. Thank you for giving us a home where we can be ourselves again. I smiled, putting the phone in my pocket. Harold had dreamed of a ranch where we could live in peace. I'd created something better. A place where women who'd lost their peace could find it again. Brandon had tried to take everything from me. My money, my house, my dignity, my freedom. Instead, he'd given me the most valuable gift I could imagine. The opportunity to discover who I really was when no one else had power over me. I'd lost a son, but I'd found a family, a chosen family. A family based on mutual respect and genuine support. A family I'd built, not with blood, but with real love. And for the first time in 65 years, I was completely free. As winter approached, the ranch transformed into something even more beautiful. Snow dusted the hills, and smoke rose from the chimneys of the small cabins. We'd grown to housing 12 women now, each with her own story of survival and resilience. One December morning, exactly 14 months after I'd bought the ranch, I received a letter. The return address was from a medium-security prison 2 states away. Brandon's handwriting. I stood in my kitchen holding the envelope, my hands steady. Gloria walked in, saw my face, and quietly put a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to read it, she said softly. I know, but I think I want to. I opened it carefully. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, with several crossed-out sections. Mom, it began. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But my therapist says I need to take accountability for what I did to you, not for my sake, but for yours. The truth is, I've been angry my whole life. Angry that Dad seemed to love you more than me. Angry that I never felt good enough. Angry that you had this happiness I couldn't understand. But none of that excuses what I did. I tried to destroy you because I was already destroyed inside. Melissa and I are divorced now. Her family won't speak to her. My probation ends in 6 months, but I'll be paying for what I did for the rest of my life. And I should. I heard about what you did with the ranch, about the women you're helping. Dad would be so proud of you. I'm not asking to see you. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that you were right. You were always stronger than any of us knew. I'm sorry it took me almost destroying you to realize that. Your son Brandon. I read it twice, then folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. What will you do? Gloria asked. Nothing, I said. He's on his own journey now. Mine is here. That afternoon, all 12 residents gathered in the main house for our weekly dinner. It had become our tradition. Cooking together, sharing stories, laughing about things that once made us cry. Barbara had made her famous apple pie. Susan had prepared a roast that filled the house with warmth. Gloria's vegetables from the garden made the salads colorful and fresh. As we sat around the long table, I'd bought specifically for these dinners, I looked at each face. Women who'd been broken, and were now healing. Women who'd been told they were worthless, and were now discovering their value. Women who'd been invisible, and were now seen. I'd like to make a toast, said Carol, the woman who'd arrived beaten and terrified 3 months ago. She stood up, her hands no longer shaking like they had that first night. To Dorothy, who gave us more than a roof. She gave us our lives back. To Dorothy, they all echoed, raising their glasses. No, I said, standing as well. To us. To every woman in this room who refused to accept that abuse was her fate. To every woman who found the courage to leave. To every woman who believed she deserved better. This isn't my refuge. It's ours. The room erupted in agreement, in tears, in laughter. Later that night, after everyone had returned to their cabins, Mike helped me clean up the kitchen. You know, he said while drying dishes, when I first met you that night at dinner, I thought you were this quiet, scared woman who needed saving. And now? I asked, amused. Now I know you're the one doing the saving. He paused. My mother wants to meet you, by the way. She's 77, still living alone, still fiercely independent. I think you two would get along. I'd love to meet her, he smiled. She said the same thing. As Mike left and I locked up the house, I walked to Harold's picture on the mantel. It was from our 30th anniversary, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. We did it, Harold, I whispered. Maybe not the way we planned, but we did it. The wind chimes on the porch rang softly, and for just a moment I could swear I felt his hand on my shoulder. The next morning brought unexpected news. Sarah called early, her voice excited. Dorothy, there's a woman from the governor's office who wants to visit the refuge. They're looking at your model as a potential statewide program. What does that mean? It means funding. Real funding. You could expand, help more women, maybe even train other people to open similar refuges. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. When Harold and I had dreamed of our ranch, we'd imagined chickens and vegetables and quiet mornings. We'd never imagined this. But isn't that what makes life beautiful? The way it surprises you, takes your broken pieces, and builds something you never could have designed yourself. When would they want to visit? I asked. Next week. And Dorothy? She paused. They want you to speak at a state conference on elder abuse. Share your story. My first instinct was to say no. I'd never been someone who spoke publicly. I'd always been quiet. Dorothy. The one in the background. The one who served the meals and asked for nothing. But that Dorothy didn't exist anymore. I'll do it, I said. The governor's representative, a sharp woman named Amanda, arrived the following Tuesday with a team of 3 others. They toured every cabin, interviewed several residents, and took copious notes. Mrs. Thompson, Amanda said, as we sat on the porch afterward, this is exactly what we've been looking for. A sustainable, community-based model for elder abuse survivors. With state funding, you could triple your capacity. I don't want to triple it, I said, and she looked surprised. I want to help train 10 other women to open their own refuges. One large facility isn't the answer. Many small ones, run by women who understand. That's the answer. Amanda smiled slowly. That's even better. Over the next 3 months, everything changed, and yet nothing changed. The refuge remained a place of peace and healing, but now it also became a place of learning. Women came from all over the state to spend a week with us, learning how to establish similar programs in their communities. I taught them what I'd learned: how to create safety, how to rebuild trust, how to help women rediscover their strength. But mostly, I taught them what Harold had tried to tell me all along, that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what you build after you've been broken. The state conference was in March, in the capital. I'd never been so nervous in my life. Mike drove me, chattering to keep me calm. You're going to be great. Just tell your story. What if I freeze? What if I forget what to say? Then you'll remember. That's what you do, Dorothy. You remember who you are. There were 300 people in the audience. Social workers, lawyers, government officials, advocates. I stood at the podium, looking out at all those faces, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I saw her in the 3rd row. A woman probably in her 70s, clutching a tissue. Her eyes already wet. And I knew. She was living it right now. Whatever hell I'd escaped, she was still in it. I took a breath and began. My name is Dorothy Thompson. I'm 66 years old, and 2 years ago, my son tried to steal my life. I told them everything. The phone calls, the plans, the breaking and entering, the fear, the rage, the moment I decided I wouldn't be a victim anymore. But I also told them about Harold's letters, about discovering I'd been living a lie, about the pain of realizing the child you'd loved had never existed. And then I told them about the refuge, about Gloria and Susan and Barbara and Carol and all the others, about how we'd built something beautiful from our collective pain. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then the woman in the third row stood up. Then another, then another. Soon the entire room was standing, applauding, some crying, some smiling. After the conference, a line formed. Women wanting to share their stories, wanting advice, wanting hope. The woman from the third row waited until everyone else had gone. My daughter, she said simply. She's been stealing from me for years. I didn't know what to do. I took both her hands in mine. Now you do. You do what I did. You choose yourself. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. How do I start? With one word, I told her. No. Just practice saying no. 6 months later, that same woman opened the second refuge in the state. Within 2 years there were 15. Brandon completed his probation and moved to Alaska. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working on a fishing boat, that he'd stayed in therapy, that he'd started going to church. I hoped it was true, not for my sake, but for his. I never saw him again. Mike said he asked once more if he could visit, but I'd sent the same message. I wish you healing, but I found mine. On the second anniversary of buying the ranch, we had a celebration. 20 women now lived in the expanded refuge. 3 more were opening their own locations. The state had formally recognized our model and provided funding. Governor Martinez came personally to present an award. Outstanding service to Colorado's elder community. Harold would have laughed. I thought. His quiet Dorothy, accepting awards from governors. But as I stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the hills he'd dreamed about, I realized something. Harold had seen this Dorothy all along, the strong one, the fighter, the woman who could survive anything. He'd just been waiting for me to see her too. Gloria joined me on the porch, 2 cups of tea in her hands. Thinking about Harold? She asked. Always, I said. He'd be proud. I think he already was, I just didn't know it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. From inside the main house came laughter. Someone was playing guitar. Someone else was singing slightly off key. The sound of women who'd remembered how to be happy. You know what the best revenge is? Gloria asked suddenly. What? This. She gestured to the ranch. The lights in the cabins. The sounds of joy. Living well. Being happy. Proving they were wrong about us. I smiled. I'd stopped thinking about it as revenge a long time ago. Now it was just life. My life. The one I'd chosen. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. New referral. 68-year-old woman. Financial abuse by grandson. Can you take her? I typed back immediately. Send her tomorrow. We have space. And we did. We always would. Because that's what Harold and I had really dreamed about all those years. Not just a ranch. Not just a quiet place to retire. We'd dreamed about a place where people mattered. Where kindness meant something. Where no one was disposable. He'd given me the money to buy the land. But I'd built something he never could have imagined. Or maybe he had. Maybe in those last days, when he was writing those letters, warning me about Brandon, telling me I was stronger than I knew, maybe he'd seen exactly this future. A refuge, not just for me, but for all the women the world had tried to make invisible. As I got ready for bed that night, I passed the drawer where I kept Brandon's letter. I hadn't opened it since that first time. Maybe someday I would again. Maybe someday I'd even write back. But not today. Today I had 12 women depending on me. A 13th arriving tomorrow. A conference call with the governor's office about expanding funding. Training sessions to plan for 3 new refuge directors. I had a life that mattered. A purpose that fulfilled me. A family I'd chosen, and who'd chosen me back. I'd started this journey as a 65-year-old widow who thought her life was over. I'd become a 66-year-old woman who discovered her life was just beginning. Brandon had tried to bury me. Instead, he'd planted a seed, and from that seed had grown something beautiful, something lasting, something real. I turned off the lights and stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the refuge, my ranch, my home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women with new stories of pain, but also new opportunities for healing, for strength, for hope. And I would be ready, because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. You can't destroy a woman who's already been broken and put herself back together. You can only make her stronger. Harold had known that. That's why he'd left me the money. Not to buy a ranch. To buy my freedom. To give me the tools to save myself. And in saving myself, I'd learned how to save others. That's the real inheritance he'd left me. Not $500,000. But the knowledge that I was worth saving, that we all were. I climbed into bed, pulled Harold's quilt around me, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and when it did, I'd be ready. Because I was Dorothy Thompson. I was 66 years old. I'd survived my son's betrayal. I'd built a refuge from ashes. I'd found my purpose in my darkest hour. And I was just getting started. Every story carries within it an echo of our shared humanity. If this story has touched your heart, share it with someone special. Leave us a comment about what you felt, and subscribe to join us for more soul-reaching stories. Because every life tells a story that deserves to be heard. See you next time.